All right. Well, Lisa, welcome back to the podcast. And Scott, we are so excited to have you here. So thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
It's an honor to have you both in the studio. And congratulations on completing this monumental project, the book, the volume, but also the entire series of saints. This is just such a massive undertaking and is such a gift to our community. So I hope you're celebrating. And we're so excited to talk about it. I wanted to start actually and just ask you to reflect a little bit about this entire series. And I'm wondering what sets this volume apart when you think back about all of the other books. What is it about this era of church history and this volume that feels different now that it's finished?
A couple things. First off, I think people who read it will notice is, of course, we're covering very recent events. Yeah. And there will be many people who read the book who this covers their lifetimes and will remember many of the landmarks that we talk about. But even so, even for people who have lived through this era, there will be something for everyone that they didn't know. There will be something new that we cover that will be unfamiliar. So I think that's one of the really cool things about this book is how it balances that familiarity with new territory in telling the story of the church during this era.
Yeah, and I think if you look at volume one, I think volume one covers roughly, 20 years, 25 years, if that. Terrible at math. But, it covers a very short amount of time, basically, just 5 years before the first vision up till about 1846. This book, like its predecessor, covers more than 60 years. And what's even more challenging with this book is that we are now, because the church is growing so big, we're now visiting more places. And it's always been our goal to make Saints a representative history of the church, because it's really impossible to write a comprehensive history of the church, something that covers everything. So what we want to do with this book is make sure that the major events of the church are represented and the major figures are represented, and that all the major developments are there, but not really try to hit on everything, because that's just impossible. So there are things that we don't cover in this book, and so we have to make choices about that. But yeah, there's just so much time to cover, so much space to cover, so many personalities and individuals to cover, that's a real challenge. And so what I think readers will notice about this book is if you read the earlier volumes, we tell the stories of individuals, and we call them point of view characters, because the story unfolds through their point of view, and we're able to linger. This is a Latter-day Saint setting, so we're able to linger longer with these characters, and that's great. I mean, as a writer, that's a really fun thing to do, because you get to know them really well. With this book, because we have to cover so much ground, we're not able to linger as long as we would like to with some characters, just so that we can get more coverage. And so the challenge of that is that we're not able to spend as much time as we want with them, but we also have to ensure that our readers don't feel like they're ping-ponging through this book, where they're like, oh, now we're here, now we're here, now we're here. We want to make sure that everything still feels smooth and seamless like the other volumes. So that's a bit of that was the big challenge for this book. And I think that's what readers will notice, is that it's just a bigger canvas, and there's just so much going on. And I think we did a good job with it. So
it's such an expansive
challenge.
Like the cast of characters compared to volume one is just so explosive. Do you have any idea how many stories?
So
or how many what did you call them? Point of view?
Yeah, point of view characters. So I don't know. I did calculations a while ago individually for the different volumes, and I then deleted the file because I didn't need the information anymore. Because I was tasked to find out how many characters.
Running out of memory, or
It just happened. So I was tasked to kind of find out how many characters were featured characters or point of view characters for the entire series. And that came to about, I think it was like 327, give or take a few.
Wow.
Characters in general, if we were to talk about secondary characters throughout the entire series, it would probably be double that or triple that. So, and what kind of blew my mind. So, the book War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. This is like if you want to flex as a reader, you say, I've read War and Peace, which I have. Okay, so I'm going to flex a little bit there.
You glance at the camera as you said that.
I did glance at the camera because I want everybody to know that I read War and Peace. But what's kind of cool about this is I was talking to somebody recently, and I will admit that I listened to the audiobook, right? And it's about 60 hours worth of great Russian fiction. And then I was talking to somebody else about the Saints audiobook and realized that each book is about 15 hours. So you do the math. And so Saints, the series, is about as long as War and Peace and has about the same amount of characters.
Wow.
We just cover, I think War and Peace covers like 20 years and we cover 200.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that just kind of gives you an idea of what we're juggling here.
It really
with this
is
book.
Extraordinarily expansive.
Yeah.
How big is the team behind the project? Or I guess we could talk about this book specifically. And I'm so curious, like who's actually sitting down at the keyboard, like writing?
Yeah. So I can speak to that a little bit. So we do have the 4 general editors. It's Lisa, me, Jed Woodworth, and James Perry, who's a historian working out of the UK right now. And then
it's a relatively small
it's
team.
a small team.
Yeah, there was us, and our job as general editors is more of the shaping, the guiding, the planning, the strategizing of what stories we want to tell and so forth. And then we've had a small team of researchers, and that has kind of fluctuated from volume to volume.
Yeah, and on this volume, I think both this volume and volume 3, we had just one primary researcher.
Yeah, with a little bit of support here and there.
With support from, the historians and whatnot.
And then we have a small team of writers.
Yeah.
On this one, we had 2.
Yeah, so I am considered the lead writer on the series, and also what's called the literary editor, which means I kind of oversee and supervise the literary aspects of the structure and the structure and style. And then we have a team of creative writers. So, I mean, we've got a contributors list at the very beginning of the book that kind of gives you a sense of who all contributed.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, the team is small.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, there's a lot of people with their hands on this.
Yeah.
Because by the time you do all of the editing and what we call reference editing, which source checking is basically what it is. And that's something that people may not fully appreciate or understand what that entails. We have this really strict set of rules for ourselves about what we can and can't say based on what's in the source. So basically, if we say someone was smiling, the source has to say they were smiling.
Wow.
If it was raining, it had to be raining.
Wow.
And dialogue?
Dialogue, all the dialogue. So everything in the book, we've got literary people, but they don't get to make anything up. So it's all factually done. And so
yeah, and the creative writers would say that is the hardest part about the job is just being faithful to the sources.
Yeah.
And I should say, this is like, there are a lot of things out there a lot of books out there that parade as nonfiction. These are popular histories. I could name a few, books by like Eric Larson or Laura Hillenbrand or these are books, these are history books that people enjoy reading. This is narrative nonfiction. But if you kind of look at how they use sources, sometimes you can see that they're speculating a little bit.
Yes.
Just to enrich the story a little bit more. I think they usually do it pretty conservatively, but they are still inserting details that aren't in the sources. And we're not allowed to do that.
We can't do that.
We don't
That's
do that
so
because we want to make
interesting.
sure that this is reliable.
And we have
piece of history.
a team, you'll see it on the credits pages, reference editors. Petra Javadi Evans was the lead on that, where they go through every page and every source and compare and make sure that we are using the sources accurately and responsibly.
Thank you for saying that. I'm so glad to know that. So I feel like a question that is probably really important to people is that, and this is part of it actually. Like I love hearing that this is so tethered to real sources. Like this isn't what you think probably happened. This is really someone wrote about this and recorded it, and this is what they recorded. But I think because this volume especially covers such important events in church history, 1955 to 2020. So we've got correlation, ERA, priesthood temple ban, Prop 8, the policy, Indian placement program. Like there's a lot going on.
It's like
in
one
this.
after another. Yeah.
Yes, like every
Yeah.
And so I think probably a really important question to people is just this. I think people probably wonder how much oversight there was over the historians. Like who is telling you what you're allowed to say, and were you allowed to write freely about periods of our church history that can be very complicated and maybe even problematic, and topics that you could write an entire book out on. You know, I hear what you're saying, Scott, that like you really kind of only have time for glimpses. And so I would imagine that there's a lot of conversation about about how you paint this picture. So can you just talk about that process and who's involved in deciding how you tell these stories?
Yeah, so it starts with us as the historians and the editors who kind of know the terrain. The researchers help us to get the stories and know more of the terrain. And but we're also, you know, generally aware of like, what are the issues? What are the difficult things? What do we need to talk about? Part of the mandate, part of the vision for this series from the beginning has been, we talk about hard things. We cover difficult topics, and we want to do that as honestly and accurately as we can. And so that figures into our planning of how can we tell these stories. In this volume, especially, it's a little tricky because where we're talking about events and people who are so recent, you do have a lot of sensibilities. Mm-hmm. You have a lot of different views, even of what happened and why. And so it's a little easier with dead people because they don't, you know, talk back, if you want to put it that way. And which is just to say that, you know, there's a role for the historian when you're dealing with the history, past history, and people who are no longer living, where we do have to interpret sources and so forth. Mm-hmm. We couldn't have Wilford Woodruff review any of our scenes about him. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But in this volume, that was one of the things, and it was a great gift to be able to go back to someone and have them look at what we had written and say, well, you know, maybe this is a little different that way or whatever. And sometimes we have conflicting memories of how things went down. And so we have to kind of make a judgment call on that. But I mean, I think a subtext on that question is always, what don't they let you say? Mm-hmm. And what's being hidden and so forth. And I can just like testify that the effort is to be as open and transparent and honest and accurate about the history as possible. And to the extent that there may be some things that people wish would be said or covered or whatever, that's often a function of different sensibilities of people who review.
Like I'm trying to think over the whole process. So, you know, we have a lot of reviewers on these books. We write up the stories and then we send them out to review. So historians look at them, church leaders look at them. We've even had young adults, just students look at them just to kind of make sure that we're speaking to their generation. We send them out to people from different countries. So we just have a lot of people reviewing, and everybody has an opinion on what should and should not be in the book. And, you know, in all of our review process, you know, in all of the reviews, I can't think of any time when it was said to us, don't talk about this.
Really?
But the conversation always is, are we saying too much or are we saying too little? And so I can give you an illustration of that for volume 2. The question was, does this book say enough about plural marriage in order to put these plural marriage stories in context? And I thought the answer was, I think we've said enough. I think the stories speak for themselves. I don't think that we need to add a lot of kind of scaffolding to help readers understand what's going on here, because we did that kind of work in volume 1. But as we discussed it as a team and counseled together, and this is a church setting, so we counseled a lot, we realized that is something that we probably should do. And so we added more about plural marriage in volume 2 just to kind of help contextualize those scenes better. And so that's usually how it goes, is we have conversations about, do we want to say more about this? Do we want to say less about this? Let's find the right balance here.
Balance.
And I think, with this book, the big question is race. We tell a lot of stories about race in the priesthood and the priesthood restriction. And we wanted to make sure that we got that balance right, because we did not want we wanted that moment at the midpoint in the book where Spencer W. Kimball has his revelation on priesthood. We wanted that moment to be significant, and the way you make that moment significant is by telling stories that show why it is necessary. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so as we were finding ways to do that, we had an abundance of material, and a lot of stories that we could have told. But we kind of whittled it down to the handful that you see in the book, because I think that's enough to make our point. And again, we didn't necessarily want that to be the only thing the first half of the book was about, even though it's a major theme.
Yeah, and I definitely think we should spend more time there, but I want to ask one more contextual question before we do. And that is, well, Lisa, you mentioned that there is an explicit goal to be as honest and accurate as possible. And I think based on what you've described, you've done a really admirable job there. I wonder if there's an additional goal, which is to, I guess, defend the church and promote faithfulness to some extent, whether that be from the organization that you're working in, or a personal goal as people of faith.
Yeah, this is the church's history. This is the history that the church wants to tell about itself. It's the narrative that we want members of the church to unite around and to know, as far as enlarging our memory and knowing our own story. So, to say defend, yes, I suppose that's one way to say it, but it's just the church saying this is who we are, and this is our story, and this is our history. You'll notice that the narrative style of Saints is to have the stories told from the point of view of the people who experience them. And we feel like that is the most powerful way to, if you want to say, build faith, that to experience people's own experiences with the Spirit, with faith, with all of the trials and, whatever goes into the life of discipleship in the church, just to tell those stories and let people tell those stories and let them speak for themselves. We don't have a narrator who breaks in and says, thus we see, and this is what you should be taking away from this story. And this is why you should, this is why this should build your faith. Yeah. But we think that the way that the stories are told is ultimately the most powerful way of being faith affirming, to see other people's faith in action.
Yeah.
One of the things I like about what Lisa just described is that the way Saints is written, it gives every reader a chance to have their own individual experience with the book and to glean their own lessons from it. We're not telling you how you should, understand this story or what lesson you should take away from this story. We're just telling the story in a very matter-of-fact way and letting the reader kind of experience it and have their kind of communion with the Spirit as they read it, if you want to put it that way, where, we just give the Spirit space to speak to the individual and let them learn the lesson they need to learn from the book. And so what I take away from Saints may be different from what you take away. Yeah. And that's how it's designed.
What I wanted to ask about is do you see, there's been a shift in the intentions of the church around church history. It feels like you mentioned Joseph Fielding Smith near the beginning of the book. And I, he was a church historian for like almost 50 years or something, right? Before he became the 10th president of the church. And so I think a lot of people, especially probably listening, who have struggled with church history in the past, I think a lot of people may be able to connect it to Joseph Fielding Smith's legacy in some ways, and to the way that my understanding is that he sort of had this approach that was sanitizing, like, let's clean up the history and make it very palatable. And then it feels like when that crumbles for people, it can become really problematic, and it can lead to all kinds of trouble with faith. Like it makes you kind of question everything. And so it feels like I can see Joseph Fielding Smith, I can see Saints, and like something happened in the middle. And I'm curious what your perspective is there. Like, when did this shift happen? And is that how you see his not his only legacy, but it feels like he has a bold footprint in church history that you've maybe been part of helping us heal from?
Well, so we could do a whole episode on the church and history, and and how we have thought about history. I mean, to a certain extent, you can look at this writ large, say in the United States, and the way that we've been grappling with the inherited narratives about history versus the reality of the actors that were involved and how much more complicated it is. So a lot of it has to do with shifts in approaches to history, questions that are being asked about history,
in the
sensibilities
church or
about history, all across the board,
Okay.
in the church and and outside of the church. I think that view of Joseph Fielding Smith, I know it has a lot of traction and a lot of legs, and I think it's also a little simplistic.
Okay.
And it's also, it is definitely true that he wielded a great deal of influence for a long time, both in his role as church historian in terms of the archives and how they thought about access to documents and so forth, and even like, did they even know what documents they had some of the time? You know, like there's a whole professionalization of the archive that takes place around the 70s that changes the field, literally, like the ground you have to work in, of understanding what sources we have and what to do with them. But the thing to understand about Joseph Fielding Smith, he was born in 1876.
Yeah.
Think about that. He's 24 years old at the turn of the century. His youth and growing up years are shaped by the raid, the anti-polygamy prosecutions, and all of the opprobrium and disparagement that was aimed at the Latter-day Saints.
And probably the very recent past. I mean, his grandfather is Hiram Smith, right?
Yeah,
so
well, that's what I was going to say. So
very close family.
His own
trauma.
lived experience is that his father is in hiding for a big part of his childhood. In fact, his mother and father go off to Hawaii for several years to avoid the federal marshals when he's like 10 years old. So there's that. And then there's the fact that he's the son of Joseph F. Smith, who's the son of Hiram. And between the two of them, their worldview and experience is very, very shaped by the sense of enemies, the sense of opposition, the very polemical, you can't give the enemies an inch of ground or they'll use it against you. And this was the context for Latter-day Saint history really up until about the 1970s, was this polemical, yes, defend the church. And it's also based on older approaches to history. It's based on oral traditions and, you know, things that are written and recorded in a way that would not really rise to the standards of the modern historical profession. That doesn't mean that they're not valuable and there's not a lot of good information in them. But the thing that's really developed is this ability to be like source critical and to look at the sources in a more sophisticated way. We actually tell a little tiny bit of the beginnings of that effort in Volume 4 when we talk about Richard Bushman and Truman Madsen and how they begin going back and going, oh yeah, actually we don't have a lot of those sources. We don't have a lot of those documents. And so Joseph Fielding Smith dies in 1972, which is the same year Leonard Arrington is appointed as the first professionally trained church historian. And so there's just this real transition that takes place in terms of how we think about history, how we approach doing history. And that becomes known as the New Mormon history, which shapes the field, you know, for the next 40 or more years. And it's on the shoulders of that development that then our iteration of the church history department, which comes into being late 2000s. Like I joined the church history department in 2013.
Okay.
When Joseph Smith Papers was just really getting rolling. We were working on the gospel topics essays, you know, and Saints was just starting to really take shape and get some momentum. So there is just like this really huge context, but underneath it all are like shifting sensibilities about what history is and sources and how we think about it, the questions we ask. Yeah. And then you add on top of that the influence of the online world, social media. I've seen that just in the time that I've been at the church history department really shift and unfortunately make history just so much more of a battlefield. Really than I think it needs to be.
I mean, I think when I think about Joseph Fielding Smith, I mean, I do think about the fact that for him, everything he wrote was designed to be a defense of the faith. That's what he lived for, was to defend the faith. And he did it the only way he knew how, or the way he thought best. When I think about him as a historian, I think about the fact that really he wanted to show the church and its history as a fulfillment of Scripture. So for Joseph Fielding Smith, the thing, like if it was good enough for Brother Joseph, it's good enough for me. And what I mean by that is that Joseph Fielding Smith believed that all you really needed to know in terms of education, all you needed to have in terms of education, is the Scriptures and the Spirit. And that is the assumption I think he worked from. And so he did not have a whole lot of time for academics and academic study, because he believed that through the Spirit and through the Scriptures and through the study of church history, he could learn all he needed to know about the work of the restoration. And he really saw it as a continuation of those scriptural prophecies. And that shaped the way he wrote about it. So it's not that I don't think sanitized is the right word, because I think if there's anybody who did not run away from controversy in the 20th century, it was Joseph Fielding Smith. I mean, if you open up Answers to Gospel Questions, you will see him tackling every single controversy imaginable. And you may not agree with what he says, but he's at least addressing it in his own way and giving his own opinion, or his own view on it. He would not use the word opinion, I think, on that one. But you know, he was very much invested in this idea of relying on the Scriptures and revelation to understand the world and to understand our heritage.
And that's not to say that we have not inherited narratives about church history that couldn't be called sanitized. And I think that actually comes a little bit later. And again, like there's a lot we could talk about there, but I think the key, again, there's this underlying concern about putting stuff out there that enemies of the church would use against us or have already used.
Oh, interesting.
You know, so there's the polemical background to it. There's also the fact that by the 1960s and 70s, the growth of the church is overtaking all other considerations. And there is this need to produce material from the church for members all over the world with vastly different levels of literacy, vastly different levels of familiarity and experience in the church and exposure to those stories. And there's very much the desire to use history as a faith promoting tool, you know, to the extent that we're going to use history at all, we're going to use it to tell stories that will build faith. And of course, the founding narrative of the church is a historical narrative. I mean, we have a historical claim at the base of our church and of our faith. So that's important. But there just wasn't the need or the consideration that the church should be in the business of, you know, really sophisticated historical questioning. And there were a lot of different sensibilities about that. And it just has taken a long time for that to shake out.
And do you feel like it has shaken out? Like, or do you feel, I know you can't speak for the church, but do you feel like the that the tide has really turned, and that there is a unified intention to be totally honest about history?
I think we have crossed some Rubicons. I think the Joseph Smith papers was really an important one. I think there are still, and probably always will be, kind of cycles in how we feel about it, and you know, just different sensibilities of different leaders and different, you know, people in curriculum departments or whatever. I mean, I don't say that disparagingly, but just, you know, there will always be a lot of variables that go into how we think about history. But as far as the baseline goes, what is considered adequate, honest, that has definitely risen a lot.
Yeah.
And I don't think we're going back on that.
Thank you so much.
Just add quickly to that, is I think just in general, we are more comfortable with the fact that we can learn from mistakes, and that we don't have to be perfect all the time. I think we're learning that you can have an incident like the Mountain Meadows Massacre and learn some valuable lessons from that. So rather than not talk about it, let's talk about it. And so you see like the work like Rick Turley has done, and Barbara Jones Brown, where they've brought forward this really, really hard narrative, but there are lessons, really vital lessons, that we can learn from it. And I think we're beginning to learn that mistakes happen, and we need to, rather than not talk about them and see what we can do, see what we can learn from them.
Yeah. Thank you. And maybe we should get into some of the actual content of the book. And maybe it'd be interesting to start by sort of setting the stage. Book opens in 1955. The large overarching story of the book is globalization, if that's the term. And do you happen to know in 1955, like what percentage of the church, for instance, was American?
So at the start of 1955 or so, about 90% of the church is in the United States and Canada, 10% outside. Okay. By the end of the book, what is it, like 40% of the church is in the United States? Something like that. It's about, you know, where we are today. But yeah, it's still very much an American church, North American church. And yeah.
I feel like we have to talk about correlation, and this is something I will admit, I think I've given it a bad rap. Like it's easy to just say, you know, to roll your eyes and feel like things are too streamlined and too tidy, and I've been kind of dismissive about it. And I actually really appreciated the way you approach correlation in this volume. It felt like I felt like you sort of built a case for it. Like it makes sense that something had to be done. Like everybody was kind of on their own, and in such remote places with such limited communication, it was so clear in a way that I had never understood before, that there was a real need to be more unified. So would you just talk about that, maybe for someone who hasn't even read the book, like why correlation, and what did it actually mean? Like what actually changed in this project? And then of course I would love to hear what you think about some of the trade-offs.
Yeah. Well, there's actually a whole history of correlation that extends back to the early 20th century.
Really?
And so what you really have, I was saying this to Scott the other day, and somebody might challenge me on this, but this is the way I think about it. Mm-hmm. Around the turn of the century in the church, you have what you could maybe call a federal system. So you have all these entities that have grown up that are committed to the church, and they're connected to the church, and they're all about the church and its mission. So the Sunday schools, the MIAs, the Relief Society, and so forth. But they each have kind of formed at different times for a little bit different purposes, and they've each developed their own structures of authority and budgets and curriculum and all of those kinds of things. Those are the most vibrant entities in the church for up to, the first half of the 20th century at least.
What's an example of one of those?
So, for example, we found that well into the 1950s, more people are going to Sunday school than to sacrament meeting.
Really?
We found a higher rate.
Even in the U.S.?
Yes.
Really?
Now, back in the day, Sunday school's in the morning, and they have the sacrament at Sunday school. So you could go to Sunday school, have the sacrament, and that's your church meeting.
It really isn't that big of a surprise that people are choosing Sunday school over sacrament. I mean, let's be honest.
Especially what sacrament meeting used to be. But
so what did it used to be if you weren't taking the sacrament?
Or did they also have the sacrament?
It was people talking. Yeah. And they had the sacrament, yes.
Okay.
But it was seen as more of like the adult meeting.
And sometimes it was like, brother so-and-so, please speak for us. Don't worry about time. Just speak until you feel prompted to stop.
Yeah.
So,
and that started to change in the early 20th century. But even by the mid-century, for example, a lot of young women are going to MIA or young women meetings more than they're going to Sunday meetings. And so these entities become the point of contact for people with the church. But they also get really, really big. And what they do is amazing. And when our young woman book comes out early next year, you can have me back and we'll talk about it then. But for example, in the 1950s, if you're a young women president, you might be given 1,000 pages of materials, manuals, newsletters, and things to read every year. And it's highly structured. It's very prescriptive. It's just this massive program. So this is where we're at when the correlation effort really starts. And so there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of redundancy. There's a lot of gaps. Like maybe you go to seminary and Sunday school and priesthood meeting and you'll learn about baptism in all of those meetings, but then repentance kind of gets missed, So this is one of Harold B. Lee's animating concerns in this correlation movement, is to bring the entities of the church into greater harmony, to reduce a lot of that overlap, frankly, a lot of the resources that are going into it. But also, I mean, it's such a fascinating period because Lee announces the correlation effort in General Conference at October of 1961. And this is when like a lot of post-war trends are starting to really hit, and like the baby boom. Those kids of the baby boom are starting to be teenagers and young people. And so it's not just that they're trying to correlate church entities. He announces it as a program of defense. We are trying to, make the church as effective as it can be so that we can fight against this rising tide of evil in the church, which they see as being aimed at families. And so actually one of the first correlation products is the Family Home Evening Manual and the home teaching program and so forth. So there's a lot more going on than just the consolidation of organizations. But the bottom line is that the vision is also to bring these federated organizations into more of a corporate structure where the priesthood is the backbone, and every entity has a clear line of priesthood oversight and authority that they deal with. So young women leaders, it would be your ward young women president would report to the stake young women president, who would report to the general young women president. But now that gets shifted to how we know it today, where in the ward you report to the bishop, and in the stake to the stake president, and so forth, so that everything can be unified under that umbrella of priesthood. So there's a lot going on in that correlation era, and yes, we tried to help people understand how the participants understood what they were doing and why they saw it as necessary. And certainly the international growth was a big part of it, but it's not the whole story.
Go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say, I think it's really easy sometimes to romanticize, the church pre-correlation because a lot of really cool things were happening organizationally, and just, you look at, for example, church magazines. Now, Lisa and I both study that era of church magazines, and we do that because it's so fascinating. Church members are producing some really, really great creative work. And they are, there's just, there's something for everyone there. And that's really cool. But at the same time, if you can imagine what it must have been like to be one of those young women trying to like figure out these thousands of pages they have to go through to kind of do their job.
Yeah,
and so, you know, on the one hand, it was really exciting. On the other hand, it was very almost unpredictable in some ways. You didn't quite know what church was going to be like.
Yeah. I totally get it. I mean, I think, so I'm by trade an entrepreneur. I'm working on a startup, just a couple dozen people. And it is so hard to keep everybody on the same page. And just recently we brought on some new people just on a contract basis who are doing some design work for us. And you would not believe how fast things deviate from what was originally planned. And you see these assets go out and it's just like, that is not what we're doing.
I would believe.
And we're not even talking about a church with, I don't know how many members there were in the 50s. But we're talking about a very small organization and how quickly things can get out of hand. So I really do get it. And yet, there are lots of, I mean, I think there are trade-offs too.
Yeah,
one of which that Aubrey and I have been talking about is that when you've got a global church and everyone needs to be essentially on the same page doctrinally, there can be, if you think about issues around, you know, race, at least in previous decades, or women or LGBTQ issues, we've at least heard a theory posited that, well, the American church might be on its own a little bit more progressive on some of these issues, but we also need to cater to cultures in which equality among men and women is not the norm, or in which you know, LGBTQ people are shunned societally. And so we can't maybe, and this is again the narrative that we've heard talked about, we can't maybe move as fast as we would otherwise. And I think it can be a little bit challenging.
Or I would say not even progressive, but like it, you know, when you're, let's like take women in particular, like when we believe, you know, there's no debate about the equality of men and women, when it feels like that needs to sort of be diluted to be palatable in a place where that isn't culturally the practice, then it feels like, we talk about equality like it's a luxury, when really, like, this is something we truly believe. So I was so fascinated about this growth, because it feels like we sort of see examples of the church not diluting what it believes is true, and finding that people are totally magnetized to that truth, not because it was compromised and palatable, but because it felt true. So yeah, I'd love to hear your reflections about the way you see this.
There's
happening
a lot
right now.
there. Yeah, there's a lot there that we could talk about. And I think a couple of thoughts as you were talking, Tim, like pre-correlation, post-correlation, there were people at the time who really struggled with the more stripped down, sanitized, if you want to put it that way, the more simplistic, or as they saw it, dumbed down, kind of approach that the church took to lessons and just really to our engagement with our own doctrine and our own scriptures. You think of people like Lowell Bennion and Jane England and some of the great thinkers of the church at that time just really struggled with what they saw happening. So it was difficult on that level.
I was just going to say, it might be worth pointing out too, that if you look at, the curriculum for Sunday schools and other classes, priesthood classes, Relief Society classes, these are not the simple text that we use today. It's not "come follow me" like you see today. Yeah. These were, really, really smart texts written by people like John A. Whitsoe and others who were some of the premier thinkers of the church at the time. So you can imagine going from that to something more simplified. It's a big shift.
Yeah. But there was also an era where the lessons were very prescriptive. Say this, quote this, show this picture, ask this question. These are the answers you want to that question.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And so a lot of that wouldn't really fly for most of us today. So that's one thing. Like there were some real struggles and still are for a lot of people about as I say, our engagement with our own doctrine and scripture and so forth. And then there are the structural institutional implications of correlation. And this is where the shorthand of correlation often gets invoked, particularly in regard to women and women's organizations, because it happens that, of that federated system that I talk about, those entities were mostly women's organizations. Oh. It was the Relief Society, it was the primary, it was the young women, there was young men, there was Sunday school. And that's what makes it complicated, because I don't think anybody sat down and said, okay, women have too much power and control in this church and we have to get rid of it. Mm-hmm. I really do not believe that was a conscious intention on anybody's part. But because the emphasis is all on priesthood, which is gendered inescapably in the way that the church understands it, it inescapably had gendered implications. And implications for those women's organizations where they lost a lot of the autonomy and initiative and control that they had. Now, you can overstate that as well. I mean, let's be clear that Belle Spafford and Florence Jacobson and whoever were running these women's organizations were not just off doing their own thing and, rubbing their hands together about what can we do. I mean, they were always consulting with priesthood leaders, local to general level. There was always a collaboration there. But I think, unfortunately, and I think this is partly a function of the era and the way that society and people had internalized norms about gender, which again are kind of wrapped up in priesthood. I think a lot of times that the women were an afterthought. Mm-hmm. And nobody actually, I think, intended that, but I think that's the way it played out. And so it was really, it was difficult. It was a big transition. But there are also ways, and we hint at this a little bit in the book, like we talk about how when the Relief Society turns its budget over to the church, and that happens with all of the organizations at the same time. So that's the other thing, is like, it's not just the women's organizations, the Sunday school, the young men, like they're all doing this too. Mm-hmm. So it's all of the organizations. But when the Relief Society turns over their budget, like it's kind of this two-edged thing, because they lose the autonomy. They're very proud. The women have been very proud for 100 years of their ability to raise and steward money. Mm-hmm. But they also don't have to keep fundraising. And those Relief Society bazaars are just such a wonderful tradition, and they're so fascinating to go back and look at. But I think it was also, dependent on where you were, a little bit of a burden. Yeah. Get the whole ward together to buy Sister Baker's doilies, and have to do that over and over again to raise money. And it was a real, it was important in some ways to relieve the members. And so multiply that by the Sunday school and the MIA and everybody doing their own fundraising. Also in the magazines, we talk about the loss of the Relief Society magazine. Oh, I love the Relief Society magazine. I can't tell you how much I love that magazine. And I've done a lot with it, and it's just such a fascinating encapsulation of mid-20th century Mormon culture. There's so much there. But that's also one of the problems, is that by 1970, it's only available in English and Spanish. And they're still publishing a lot of articles that just really don't have a lot of applicability beyond the Wasatch Front or beyond the United States. One famous example is that they'd have an article on how to go to the supermarket and shop for cuts of meat. Now, does that mean getting rid of the Relief Society magazine had to be the answer? There's lots of roads not taken. Yeah. But it's understandable. It's more understandable why things took the shape they did when you can really get back into that context.
I think that's really helpful to understand, because if all you're looking at are the trickle down, byproducts, the feeling like if you don't understand the intention, then you can imagine that the intention maybe was to put women in their place. And so it does feel like really important context to understand that maybe there were some negative byproducts that were not the intention. And so then we can find ways to adapt. Like, how can we find some autonomy? How can we find a way to magnify women's voices, or recognizing places where that maybe were not meant to hurt women, but did, so that we can push energy there and find ways to be correlated and hear women's voices and give independence to women, if that wasn't the intention in the first place. And that was helpful to understand that.
I think it's only pretty recently that we're even able to have those conversations, and that we're able to really say out loud all those implications. And part of the reason for that is because all of these correlation changes hit in the late 60s and 70s against the backdrop of the ERA, feminism, and what so many members and leaders of the church saw as just this dangerous, radical cultural revolution. And it made it so much more fraught and so much more difficult to try to talk about women and women's issues, and for women to try to talk about their own experience. And, to the extent that they had questions or concerns or wounds about this, it made it that much more difficult to even talk about it.
To be nuanced about it, probably.
Yeah, because we're in this context of, we've got to fight against this radicalism and fight the feminists, and that kind of stuff. And any woman who speaks up and speaks out is seen as rocking the boat, and kind of, so it's just so complicated. Yeah. It's just so complicated.
Thank you so much.
And
that's
on
so
this issue though of like cross-cultural correlation, do you feel like, just to ask directly, do you feel like church materials would be different?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, it's always hard to speculate. I mean, what would church curriculum look like if we weren't trying to cater to everyone all at once? Is that essentially what you're asking?
Yeah.
I think absolutely they would be different. That's my view, at least. I mean, I think the church does a lot of research, does a lot of surveys, trying to find out what interests people and what does and does not work with people. And I think if we were to implement some sort of system where church products were designed specifically for regions, then they would very much, my assumption would be, and my hope would be, that they'd very much talk to the proposed audience and learn what's needed and tailor those materials to them. Now, the challenge with that, though, is that nowhere is monolithic. Every place has diversity. Yeah. And my question would be, is it really possible to speak to everyone?
Yeah.
I don't know, but I think people value efforts to reach out to them, specifically to the individual. I know that, just talking about saints, one of the choices we made was to make sure that the volume is available to all saints, regardless of language, at the same time, at the same day. Mm-hmm. It's 14 languages that covers about 99% of church membership there. So there are some languages, obviously, where we haven't, that don't have saints, but by and large, we're able to reach a vast majority of saints with these books. Yeah. And that effort to publish in all these languages on the same day has meant a lot to people around the world. I just recently got a message from a friend from Brazil who said that is something that means a lot to the international church, because it is designed to reach out specifically to them. It's not just, here's something that we put together for the American church and you guys can use it as you see fit. It really is a gesture toward everyone, the whole church. Yeah. And I think that means a lot to people.
That's really cool.
And I would just counter your question a little bit with a couple of things. So first of all, you could make a case that with the really quite stripped down, bare bones kind of curriculum and framework that we operate within now, that actually in practice that does get adapted to the local conditions.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's
scaffolding. Yeah.
I don't know,
There's
but
flexibility.
It does
I
seem like a
haven't
gesture
traveled a
toward
lot.
that direction, though.
Yeah,
you know?
but I can imagine that even, teaching Elder Bednar's talk from conference in my ward is probably going to look different in Brazil and in Ghana and wherever. So that's part of it. And then second of all would be like the assumption behind it would look different if it was done for an American audience. Like, how would it look different and who would decide what it's supposed to look like?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there talk about a lot of different sensibilities, and what would work for some people wouldn't work for others. And I think, that's part of like the fundamental goal and understanding that has brought us from the correlation movement to where we are, is that we need to teach the doctrine. We need to teach the scriptures. We need to teach the basic fundamental truths of the gospel, and that's the thing we can all unify around. There's this great story from our work on the young women history in the 1930s when they were having what we call the modernity crisis. And that's all I'm going to say. You'll have to ask me about it later. But they're talking about the young people and their experience at church, and they're worried that they're losing the young people. And one of the women who's on the MIA board talks about how she was talking to young people in, her ward or stake or whatever. And one of them was a young man who'd recently returned from a mission. And he said, well, I don't know why I would want to go to priesthood meeting, because all it is a bunch of old men sitting around talking about when the 12 tribes are going to come back.
In the 1930s, this was
And then you had a lot of that pre-correlation. Wow. You had a lot of that kind of, speculation, people getting interested in esoteric things. And, there's a whole line that we can go off on that's not always helpful for everybody.
Yeah. And I think that's right. And I think if you take the opposite of correlation to its completely logical extreme, it's that everyone gets catered exactly to them, which is impossible. Yeah. Right. It can never happen. And I think maybe the church does a little bit better with this than we actually give it credit for in a lot of ways, in the sense that for many of us, who are not converts, from the age of 8 onward, from confirmation onward, and we've been given the gift of the Holy Ghost, we've essentially been asked to claim our own spiritual authority in some ways.
Yeah.
And
that's new.
Yeah.
Like that is a product of the last 40, 50 years. Really even more than that, probably, because I grew up in the 1970s. And that wasn't what we were taught. I was in Young Women in the 80s, and you never would have heard anybody say, you have spiritual authority.
Well, and
it was get a testimony and let us tell you what that testimony is going to look like.
Yeah. I think this is an ongoing transformation.
You talk about the young women values. Obedience originally was on the table as a value, right? And then so maybe that was right when that kind of shift was happening. Like, is it about obedience to authority as a value in and of itself? And thank goodness that conversation continued, but that was super interesting.
Yeah, and to be clear, I'm not saying, I think in some cases we are explicitly being asked to claim spiritual authority. And I meant more with that comment. The gift of the Holy Ghost is an implication that we have some spiritual authority.
Totally.
Okay, we have to. I really want to spend some time on the priesthood temple ban, of course. And I know that this should be an entire episode. I'm gonna just say I think that our audience is probably very familiar with this transition and has probably done a lot of the legwork already on understanding how this happened. So I don't want to spend a lot of time there. What I really would like to ask you is this. It was something that was new to me was just hearing these incredibly beautiful stories of people across the world who had so much faith and energy and patience around this change. And it felt like there was sort of this acceptance that it's a matter of time and we're going to be faithful by being patient and by waiting, and we have all this hope. And then they were right, and it changed. And now we look back and we say, like, look at their faith. Like, look how they were hoping and being, I want to say advocates, but I know that word is so loaded, but like you tell the story of Darius Gray, and like he is in the middle of it, and he is agitating, but in this way that looks like sustaining, like he is showing up and he's saying, I see a problem and I want to be part of the solution, and here are ideas, and here's another idea, and here's another idea, and I will do work. And I love that in this volume, like that is framed in the most beautiful, faithful way. Like all of those people were sustaining their leaders by raising their hand and speaking up and being creative sometimes and having hope. And what I see now is that I feel like had we been living in that time, I'm not sure that in their ward that it would have been talked about that way. Like my experience is that before the change happens, hope looks like rebellion. It looks like disobedience. It looks like being unfaithful and not trusting. And I didn't get that vibe so much in the book, but I'd really like for you to talk about it because I know you were in those sources. And like, what was the experience on the ground? Like, were there leaders saying, thank you for being so faithful? Or was there a feeling of being edgy by being hopeful?
Yeah. Well, I can speak to that. So, what's interesting and I think what comes out in this volume is that the restriction operates in different ways in different parts of the world, or it's received in different ways in different parts of the world, and responses to it are different. And, we see in the story of Darius Gray, in the United States where, this is the 1960s where questions of race and race relations, everything is very heated. And we see that scene where Darius Gray is at Wyoming, and he's at the University of Wyoming, and there's protests over the church and the priesthood restriction, and he's kind of called up to help defend the church, and part of him wants to go out and advocate with those who are advocating and those who are protesting, and part of him also wants people to recognize that he has a firm conviction that this is the true gospel. And I mean, that's what he learns when he is deciding whether or not he wants to join the church. He finds out about the priesthood restriction like a day before his baptism, and it just wrecks him. And what he does is he prays, and he gets this witness that this is the true church and he needs to join. And so even though he wants things to change, he also recognizes that he needs to be faithful in his own way. And so that for me is very powerful. And then we see, in Ghana and Nigeria, people learn about, you have people like Anthony Obena or Joseph William Billy Johnson who are learning about the restriction. And it's almost like they say, okay, that's fine. We understand that that's the case. We still want to be baptized. We still want the church to come here. Please, just whatever it takes, send us missionaries so that we can have the church here, so that we can receive baptism. And they don't get that wish granted. They have to wait. And so what they do instead is they form their own congregations. And it's a really interesting response to the restriction. Is they organize their own congregations and they have their own leadership. All the while, in fact, they're even performing at times their own baptisms with the understanding that one day somebody will come to perform a baptism with authority. And so it's, again, this is very different from what we're seeing in other parts of the world. In Brazil, it's such an interesting context when you think about it, because there you have a very racially diverse society. So, and it doesn't have racism exists in Brazil, but you don't see the extreme segregation that you saw in the United States or in South Africa. You see a lot more interracial relationships. There's among some people in the population, there's some racial ambiguity. And so for some people like Elio da Rocha Camargo, who's the first Brazilian you meet in the book, he is of European ancestry, and he is able to receive the priesthood, and he eventually is able to serve in the church, as a counselor in the mission presidency or as a bishop later on. And that's his experience. And he doesn't quite get why the restriction exists, because, in Brazilian society, like I said, it doesn't have the same kind of separation of the races that you would see in like the segregated United States. And so it doesn't quite make sense to him, but he kind of accepts it out of faith. And then you have an example of Elvesio and Hula Martins, who do have who are of African descent. And he's very prominent in his community. Both of them are he's a leader in his business. Really, he has every avenue in life open to him, except at church, where he is restricted. He and his wife are restricted from temple attendance. Not that they had a temple in Brazil at the time, but if they don't even have the option, right? So, he has, every avenue in life seems open to him, but, this restriction. So at church, he is not able to hold priesthood leadership positions. He can be the Sunday school president, or he can be in the Sunday school presidency, and his wife can serve in the Relief Society. But any sort of calling that requires priesthood authority, he cannot hold that office or have that calling. And they don't have any expectation that they will ever be able to go to the temple and be sealed together as a couple. It's just off limits to them. And they have no hope. Well, I shouldn't say they have no hope, but there is no expectation that their son will be able to serve a mission. Although, as you find out in the book, I don't want to ruin everything, but they do have hope that might be the case. They receive a promise that gives them a glimmer of hope that might be a reality. And this is an incredibly painful thing for them because, as we show in the book, they become very instrumental in contributing to the temple. They contribute funds to the construction of the São Paulo temple, which was being constructed in the mid-70s.
Knowing they wouldn't be allowed to
enter. And there's this really heartbreaking scene where they are visiting the construction site and standing on the spot. They know where, it's the spot, and they know it's going to be where the celestial room is. And all they can do is weep because they know that they will never be able to enter that if things stay the same. And yet they wait on the Lord. They have that faith. And, it's unfathomable to think about nowadays. I mean, the world in some ways is so different today. The way we think about race is so different today. The way we think about even church is different today. And so just that scenario seems so foreign to us, but it was absolutely real. And I should talk about this as well, is there's another population in Brazil. And like I said, it's a very, a segment of the population is very racially ambiguous because of intermarriage. And so missionaries sometimes had no idea if the person they were teaching had any sort of African ancestry, because it could be, the color of the skin could be because of indigenous ancestry. It could be because of African ancestry. It could be any number of things. And so for that population, there was always the question of, can I participate fully in this church? And we know of some stories where, there was an individual who, maybe, I think the one I'm thinking of, he was serving in a leadership position that required priesthood, and he found out that one of his ancestors was of African descent. And at that point, he had to make a decision. Do I tell my leaders about this, or do I just keep it a secret? And if I recall correctly, adding some pressure to this problem is that he had a daughter who was
going to be married.
Which, the implication would be if they ever wanted to go to the temple, they would not be able to because of this restriction. But he ended up telling his leaders, and I think the solution was, well, we're not, what's done is done. We're not going to strip the priesthood from you, but you are, we ask that you just don't use it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so it's really interesting that, in all these different parts of the world, we have different stories. And one of the commonalities is that, they just trusted that this was not going to be the case forever. And it's just an incredible amount of faith. I mean, I'm especially moved by the story of Joseph William Billy Johnson, because I was good friends with his son, who lived in my ward in Ohio when I lived there. And I became really close to him, and he would tell me stories about his father and what it was like and what his father had to sacrifice to be a believer in the restoration at this time. And it is not faith that, it is an indescribable faith, an unbelievable faith. And I just can't imagine.
Yeah. I think that what struck me was just the messiness of it. You know, this is a place
Very
where
messy, yeah.
Yeah, I think we all would prefer a tidy story, and it's messy.
Yeah, and I think that's what happened was, you know, Spencer W. Kimball was a world traveler. I mean, when he became president of the church, he made it a priority to travel throughout the world, and he went to Brazil a number of times, and he saw the messiness. Mm-hmm. And he saw how things were not working there, and how things needed to change if the church was going to grow in Brazil. And more that priesthood restriction did not make sense, just logistically.
And sorry, did you finish?
No,
your thought?
go ahead.
Okay. I think the reason this, of course, feels so relevant is that, you know, for parents who have a gay child, I think this is the first generation where the average age of a person coming out is now in their teens. And so for the first time, we have this generation of Latter-day Saints who have children who live at home, who are out and trying to decide what to do. And I know that there are families who are in that mess, like who are in this mess saying, does faith look like hoping for change? Does it look like hanging on? Does it look like trying to make this feel okay the way it is forever, you know? And that's the mess. And I think it's the mess that you kind of talk about, that people were wrestling with, is this doctrine, or did this somehow trickle down in a way that it should never have been? Like people didn't know. And I think, and so it feels relevant because there are, you know, families who love the church, families who love their kid, who are trying to decide what being a disciple looks like. And it's painful and messy. And this feels like a place where we might be able to learn something from our history. And I recognize that that's really outside of your purview as historians, but I would love to know what you learn from this era of especially turbulent church history.
It's a really good question. I think people's experience is sacred. That's what I think. And we tell certain stories. There are other stories if you read between the lines in some of these stories. So I think, was it Ruff and Bridgeforth's sons? He talks about how they quit going to church because they couldn't have the priesthood. And, you know, for teenage boys, that means, you know, you meet with all these other boys in a quorum and you're not part of it, you know, and so forth. And so people dealt with it in a lot of different ways. But I think, as Scott has talked about, as we've talked about, just seeing the experience of others is something that we have to just honor, and treat as sacred. And we don't know the answers.
I agree.
We don't know all the answers.
Yeah.
I think one of the hardest things about writing this book is that by the end of the book, there are still a few open stories. And I think, you know, the experience of LGBTQ people is one of those open stories. We don't really know the ending of that story yet. And so I think, you know, I think some people might read the book and wonder why we didn't say more about it. And I think one of the reasons why we didn't say more about it is we wanted to make sure that what we do say about it stands the test of time. And so if you look at the book, we cover what the church's stance on it. You know, it's, you know, as we're covering Prop 8, for example, we make it clear where the church stands. But we have the quote in there from M. Russell Ballard, talking about the need to care for these individuals and to love these individuals. And, you know, I don't know what it's like to be, you know, in that community. But I know that each of us have been called to love, and we have all been called to be kind, and we have all been called to, you know, carry the burdens of others, to mourn with those that mourn, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes it is hard to be a church member. And I say that as somebody who loves the church, more than I can express. This is my home. This will always be my home. And sometimes it's a hard home to be at. But I have faith that Christ is at the head of the church, that God will show us the way, that God will finish these stories in a way that is satisfying to all of us. I don't know what that's going to look like. I'm not going to speculate that, but I do know that God is at the helm. And I think that's one of the lessons of saints. We make mistakes. The church has made missteps. You see them in the book. But we have a way of finding our way.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. That's really beautiful. I feel like that is such a gift of this series, is just painting a much bigger picture that is big enough to contain the bumps and the mistakes. And it just feels like the gift is perspective. So really appreciate that.
And I really love the framing. And Aubrey, I think the original question that you asked on this topic is one of the best questions that's ever been asked in the history of Faith Matters. I truly
did we answer it all right?
Yes, and I really, really appreciate both of your honesty and engagement with the discussion, and just the idea that we truly don't know what's going to happen, and yet engaging with I think the book gives us permission to engage in messiness, to wrestle with messiness, and to frame that work and hope in change and patience as faithfulness. And as you said, Scott, as sort of like a next level of faithfulness, I think is really beautiful. And I think we're experiencing that, especially when we see people who are so intimately engaged in these struggles without knowing what the answers are going to be. So truly appreciate you.
I've thought a lot about this, about history this way, where like we have the benefit, we know what happened. We know what happened next. They didn't. They knew what came before, but they didn't know what was coming next. And that's true in any moment of history. And so we can often impose our knowledge and our sensibilities back onto people in different circumstances. But I think it makes their faith and their trust and their hope all the more sacred and inspiring when we remember that they didn't know how it was going to work out. And yet here we are. And I just have to say about Darius, just one of the most amazing human beings. Scott probably interacted with him more than I did, but he is just a powerful, beautiful human being. It's a privilege to tell his story.
Yeah, just the amount of trust he gave us to tell his story. And I think that's one of the great blessings that came out of Volume 4 and all the research that was done. Is I wasn't involved in most of the interviews with him. Those were done by other members of our team, but we sat down with him at least a half a dozen times to get his story. And he is a great storyteller. And all the times that I was able to sit in on those interviews, it always ended with, I would say, the most powerful feeling of the Spirit. Wow. To have Darius Gray, and he probably says this to everyone, but to have Darius Gray look at you and say, "You are my brother," that is a lot of trust. Wow. To put in. And anyway, he's just a terrific guy.
Thank you so much for sharing. We have to draw a line. We have to stop somewhere. I hope people will read this book and really from the bottom of our hearts, we're so grateful for this project, but also for your candid way of approaching some stuff that's hard. So we really, really appreciate this. And also just for the gift of being able to witness our own community, witness these stories that we didn't know. And it just feels like the church feels more like a family. It feels more like home. It's being aware of the web that is connecting us. So we're just really so grateful for you both.
Yeah. In the midst of all of these messy issues, let's not lose sight of how many stories there are in here of just the pure power of God in people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you go back to Saints Volume 1, What were those early people looking for? They were looking for the power of God in their lives. And that is the thread that runs all the way through this series and through the history of the church. It looks different at different times. We understand maybe the way it's going to be manifest differently, but the power of God is in this church and has been in the history of this church from the beginning up to the present, and these stories bear witness of that.
Yeah. Well, thank you both, and thank you to your team and to the church for pushing this forward. This matters.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Lisa Olsen Tait and Scott Hales. You can find the latest volume of Saints at Desert Book on the church's website or on Amazon. And if Faith Matters content is resonating with you, we'd love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. We read all of the reviews, and it really helps us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we appreciate the support. Thanks again for listening, and remember, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.